She had learned over 5 decades of life that silence was sometimes the only armor strong enough to hold a world in place. In the office that morning, the soft hum of air conditioning blended with the quiet rustle of papers, forming the familiar soundtrack of her routine. She sat at her wide desk near the window, the surface neatly organized, each document aligned with intention. The city stretched outside the glass like a restless painting, but inside her space everything remained controlled, measured, predictable. She liked it that way. Predictability was a currency she had spent years cultivating. Her colleagues often described her as poised, admirable, disciplined, traits she wore like medals carved from effort rather than talent. Yet beneath those layers existed the part of her no one saw, the persistent reminder of age that visited her in small reflections, subtle aches, and the certainty that every room required her to prove competence twice, sometimes 3 times, before anyone relaxed enough to believe it. She felt those reminders sharply that morning. The mirror in the restroom had been unkind, or perhaps simply honest. The faint lines at the edges of her eyes seemed deeper, the silver strands of hair more noticeable. She had tied her hair up anyway, refusing to surrender to the impulse of hiding anything. Still, the reflection lingered in her mind as she sorted through reports, glancing occasionally at the screen filled with statistics she could interpret with ease, but never with softness. Her desk lamp cast a warm circle on the wood, highlighting years of dedication, notes written in her precise handwriting, folders marked with color-coded tabs, a schedule meticulously planned. Yet the weight she carried wasn't the pressure of tasks. It was the accumulation of expectations, the silent obligation to remain unfaltering. People admired strong women, but they rarely wondered how much that strength cost. As she worked, voices floated from the hallway, laughter from younger colleagues, a conversation about weekend plans, someone complaining about deadlines with the casual ease of someone who believed time was abundant. She remembered being like that once. Not carefree, but far less aware of the invisible expiration dates that society quietly stamped on women as the years passed. She had crossed several of those supposed thresholds and refused to disappear, though the effort of resisting invisibility often left her weary. There was a photo frame on her desk, nothing personal, just an award ceremony from years prior where she stood beside other executives. She looked polished, composed, distant even. The woman in the picture seemed untouched by doubt, wearing a confidence that now felt borrowed. She wondered when exactly she had learned to anticipate judgment before it arrived, to brace herself even when no harm was approaching. Age taught many lessons, but not all of them felt like wisdom. Her phone buzzed with reminders, meetings, presentations, a brief lunch squeezed between tasks. She breathed in slowly, grounding herself. This was her territory, the place where she excelled. Yet perfection had become both shield and cage. Every achievement came with a quiet fear. Would the next be dismissed because she was no longer young? Would people interpret her firmness as bitterness, her experience as inflexibility, her caution as fragility? She pushed those thoughts aside, focusing instead on the spreadsheet open on her monitor. Numbers behaved. They didn't whisper about age or appearances. They answered to logic alone. But even as she worked, the weariness under her skin persisted. It wasn't physical fatigue. It was the heaviness of being endlessly evaluated through lenses that grew harsher the older she became. A knock on the door broke her concentration. She straightened instinctively, masking whatever softness remained on her face. A colleague entered with quick updates, speaking rapidly, unaware of the quiet storm that had been forming beneath her composed expression. She nodded, offered solutions, gave instructions with calm authority. The colleague left satisfied, never suspecting how carefully she held herself together. When the door closed again, the silence returned, wrapping around her like a familiar coat. She exhaled deeply, letting herself feel the weight of another day spent performing precision and restraint. Outside, the sky shifted, clouds drifting slowly, indifferent to deadlines and insecurities. She watched them for a moment, imagining the simplicity of drifting without expectation. But she didn't drift. She anchored, she produced, she persevered. she adjusted her glasses, returned her attention to her work, and reminded herself, as she did every morning, that strength was not something she displayed for others, but something she maintained to keep her own world intact. Yet even she didn't fully realize how deeply this armor had fused with her identity, or how much of it would soon be challenged by a presence she had not asked for, a connection she had not anticipated, and a single public sentence she could never have predicted. For now, she remained at her desk, unaware that her carefully constructed stability was already shifting, slowly, quietly, in ways she had no control over. The first time she noticed him, truly noticed him, it wasn't because of his appearance but because of the way he listened. She was standing at the front of a crowded meeting room, presenting findings to a group that seemed more interested in their phones than her words. As she spoke, her eyes drifted around the room out of habit, measuring engagement, adjusting tone and clarity. Most faces remained predictably distracted, except his. He sat near the middle of the table, posture relaxed but attentive, expression calm, gaze focused with an intensity that didn't demand attention, yet offered it wholeheartedly. It was unusual, almost disarming. Amid the sea of impatience, he looked at her as if every word mattered. She didn't know him then, just that he was new, young, and assigned to the same project she was leading. After the meeting, people dispersed quickly, papers shuffled, chairs scraped, conversations resumed. But he approached her with a quiet, respectful confidence, thanking her for the clarity of the presentation and offering a brief observation that revealed he had not only listened but understood. She responded with her usual formal distance, yet something subtle shifted inside her, like a small door cracking open without permission. Over the following days, their interactions multiplied. He joined her team's discussions, sitting with a notebook where he wrote small, precise notes in handwriting that somehow mirrored his demeanor. Clean, thoughtful, steady. He rarely spoke over others, but when he did, his voice carried a tone that invited attention without competing for it. She found herself noticing his restraint, his patience, the way he considered multiple perspectives before contributing. It reminded her of qualities she had once valued in herself before time, and pressure sharpened her edges. But what unsettled her most wasn't his intelligence. It was his gaze. Whenever she explained something, he watched her with genuine concentration, not the forced interest people offered out of obligation. She wasn't accustomed to being observed like that. Not after years of feeling simultaneously visible and dismissed, admired professionally, yet overlooked personally. His attention, though innocent, felt like sunlight reaching parts of her she had long stopped tending. And then, there was his smile. It appeared rarely, never exaggerated, always sincere. When he smiled at her across the table, it was as if he momentarily acknowledged something only the two of them perceived, an unspoken understanding, a quiet respect that slipped beneath her defenses. She fought the urge to look away too quickly, not wanting to reveal how unexpectedly warm that simple expression made her feel. In group meetings, he often positioned himself so she could see him without effort. She wondered if it was intentional, then dismissed the thought immediately, unwilling to entertain a possibility that felt inappropriate. Still, it didn't stop her from noticing. He defended her ideas tactfully during debates, redirecting conversations when others dismissed her points. Though he never did so in a way that exposed his intentions, he simply supported her, naturally, rhythmically, without drawing attention. She admired his calm. He navigated tense discussions with ease, even when older colleagues challenged him. His youth wasn't loud or impulsive. It was quiet, thoughtful, steady, a contrast to the restless energy she associated with his age. It fascinated her in ways she didn't dare articulate. Yet beneath her composed exterior, a tension grew. She became hyper-aware of every interaction, every moment when his shoulder brushed hers accidentally in a narrow hallway, every shared glance during presentations, every brief exchange where his voice softened slightly when addressing her. She told herself not to read into any of it, that her mind was simply playing tricks under the weight of her own insecurities. Still, her pulse betrayed her when he stood too close, and a small warmth bloomed in her chest whenever he looked at her with that gentle attentiveness. She tried to maintain distance. She spoke to him with formality, kept meetings strictly professional, avoided unnecessary conversations. Yet he never made it difficult. He didn't push, didn't flirt, didn't cross boundaries. He simply existed near her with a presence that felt like a calm tide brushing the edges of a coastline. Persistent, soft, impossible to ignore. And she began to change, imperceptibly at first. She straightened her posture a little more when he entered the room. She found herself choosing earrings that framed her face more delicately, not out of vanity, but out of a quiet desire to feel visible again. She hated that she did it. She loved that she felt it. The contradiction lived inside her like a secret she wasn't ready to acknowledge. He didn't know the effect he had on her, or maybe he did in the way perceptive people do. Subtly, intuitively, without naming things. But their dynamic grew, day by day, shaped by details too small for others to notice and too powerful for her to ignore. She had lived for years believing that certain parts of her no longer stirred, that admiration and tenderness belonged to an earlier version of herself. But his presence, steady and unassuming, began to awaken something she thought had long settled into silence. And though she would never admit it aloud, his quiet smile had already begun to rewrite the rhythm of her days. The convention center rose like a polished monument of glass and steel, its mirrored surfaces reflecting the shifting colors of the city. Inside, the air buzzed with the hum of conversations, footsteps, and the constant screech of rolling equipment being pushed from one room to another. It was the kind of environment where people performed confidence, where every badge, handshake, and smile held layers of strategy. She knew this world well. She had navigated it for decades. Their team had been invited to present the project's early results. It was an important event, one that pulled together professionals from different branches, creating the perfect stage for observation, comparisons, and unspoken hierarchies. She stepped into the building with her usual composure, wearing a tailored suit that reinforced the authority she worked so hard to maintain. Yet as soon as she crossed the entrance, she felt the familiar tightening in her chest, the quiet pressure to embody strength flawlessly. He walked a few steps behind her, reviewing notes as they approached the registration area. His presence felt like a steady anchor, even though she kept her eyes forward, refusing to acknowledge the comfort he brought. She sensed him, his quiet confidence, his patient rhythm, but she forced emotional distance. In a place filled with watchful eyes, she protected every gesture, every glance. Inside the main hall, tall banners waved from the ceiling, announcing panels and workshops. People moved like currents, flowing between rooms, forming clusters of conversations that shifted constantly. She greeted colleagues with controlled warmth, exchanged courteous smiles, and discussed schedules as if everything inside her was calm. Yet every so often her gaze drifted involuntarily, searching for his figure among the crowd. He was easy to spot, his posture upright, his steps unhurried, his expression attentive rather than anxious. He carried his youth in a grounded, almost quiet way, contrasting sharply with the frantic energy around them. When their eyes met briefly from across the hall, she looked away faster than she intended, startled by how exposed she suddenly felt. The first panel brought them to the same row of seats. Colleagues filled the chairs around them, commenting on the event, laughing about travel mishaps, discussing industry gossip. She kept her attention on the speaker, nodding at appropriate moments, pen in hand as though annotating key points. But she was aware of him beside her, the slow, thoughtful way he took notes, the subtle shifts in his breathing, the calm presence that neither pressed nor retreated. During the break, they moved with the crowd toward the coffee station. Trays of pastries and tall silver urns of coffee lined the tables. People gathered in loose circles, exchanging superficial conversations under the fluorescent lights. She reached for a paper cup just as he approached from the opposite side. Their fingers didn't touch, but the proximity startled her enough that she almost dropped the cup. He offered a soft nod, a gesture so gentle it unsettled her balance more than any loud greeting could have. She stepped back quickly, putting distance between them under the pretense of finding a quieter corner. She hated how reactive she felt, how easily his nearness stirred something warm and unguarded inside her. She wasn't supposed to feel this way. Not here, not at this stage of life, not toward someone so much younger. It was easier to hold herself apart, to protect whatever remained of her dignity. In the next session, they ended up seated several rows apart. She felt oddly relieved at first, yet found herself glancing in his direction more times than she cared to admit. He didn't look her way, at least not while she was watching, but every instinct told her he was aware of her presence, the same way she was aware of his. The afternoon workshops required smaller groups, and by chance, or perhaps something quieter guiding the moment, they were assigned to the same discussion table. Their colleagues formed a loose circle, and as people introduced themselves, she felt his gaze brush her profile like a soft acknowledgement. She kept her eyes on her notes, pretending she didn't feel the subtle shift in the air between them. Throughout the discussion, he supported her points with quiet consistency, reinforcing her ideas with examples and data. He didn't overshadow her. He elevated her. The respect in his tone was unmistakable. It affected her more than it should have. When the session ended, people filed into the hallway, chatting loudly about dinner plans and networking opportunities. She walked ahead, intending to maintain the distance she believed was necessary. But then she felt the weight of his gaze again, a brief pull that made her pause before stepping into the escalator crowd. They did not speak. They did not walk together. Yet the space between them felt charged with something unspoken. Recognition, maybe, or tension, or a truth neither of them had the courage to name. As she exited the building, the evening air cooling her flushed skin, she realized something unsettling. Avoiding him did nothing to quiet the connection. If anything, it made it louder. The rehearsal room was smaller than she expected. A quiet, carpeted space with dim lights and a large screen mounted on the wall. It felt oddly intimate, as if designed to strip away the distractions of the crowded convention and leave only the essentials: a presenter, a script, and the truth behind every word. She stood near the podium, reviewing her slides, pretending the stillness didn't unsettle her. He entered moments later, carrying his notebook and that same composed calm that seemed to follow him everywhere. The door clicked softly behind him. She felt the air shift, the room narrowing around the two of them. She kept her eyes on the laptop, as though absorbed in last-minute adjustments. "I thought I could help you run through the presentation," he said, gently, without expectation, without intrusion. She didn't respond immediately. Accepting help felt like admitting vulnerability, something she avoided instinctively. But she also knew he understood the material almost as well as she did, and refusing would only draw unnecessary attention to her discomfort. She nodded, keeping her expression neutral. He stood a respectful distance away, listening as she began. Her voice echoed faintly in the small room, controlled but tight around the edges. She walked through the data, the projections, the recommendations, all things she could recite in her sleep. Yet her delivery felt stiff, detached, like someone imitating confidence rather than inhabiting it. When she finished, he waited a moment before speaking. "Your explanations are strong," he said, "but you're rushing through the parts you know best." His tone wasn't critical. It was observant, gentle, almost protective. She bristled anyway, more at herself than at him. She adjusted her papers. "I'm not rushing," she replied, her voice sharper than intended. He didn't flinch. "You are," he said softly. "Only when you get nervous." The words landed deeper than she expected. Nervous. She hadn't allowed herself to feel or admit nervousness in years. It seemed like an emotion belonging to someone younger, someone unsure of their place. She straightened her posture, preparing to retort, but he looked at her with such calm sincerity that the defensiveness dissolved before reaching her lips. He stepped closer, not too close, but enough that she could see the quiet concern in his eyes. "You're good at this," he continued, "but you don't let yourself look human when you're presenting. You hide every part that feels fragile." The honesty startled her. He wasn't criticizing her performance. He was seeing her, too clearly. She turned back to the screen, trying to regain distance. "It's not about fragility. It's about professionalism." "I know," he replied. But professionalism doesn't mean disappearing behind a shield. The sentence stayed in the air between them, sharper than either expected. She felt heat rise in her chest, not embarrassment, but something far more complicated. Being seen, really seen, had never been comfortable for her, and coming from him, it felt dangerously intimate. They ran the presentation again. His presence shifted the atmosphere, grounding her. Whenever she stumbled over a sentence, he offered a quiet suggestion. Whenever she rushed, he slowed her with a simple, steady look. It wasn't flirtation. It was respect. But that respect reached her in places she rarely allowed herself to feel. As they moved through the final slides, she became increasingly aware of her insecurities. How the overhead lighting cast harsher shadows on her face than on his. How her voice occasionally trembled. How she feared someone would compare them and find her wanting. The age difference loomed in her thoughts like an uninvited guest. She wondered if he ever noticed it the way she did, if he saw the lines on her skin, the years etched into her posture. Yet whenever she faltered, he met her eyes with a quiet steadiness that dismantled her assumptions. There was no pity, no condescension, no subtle patronizing, only admiration, genuine, unobtrusive admiration. In one moment, she lost her place in the presentation. A small mistake, barely noticeable. She exhaled sharply, frustration tightening her shoulders. Before she could apologize, he shook his head gently. "Don't do that," he said. "Don't make yourself smaller for a mistake you'd forgive in anyone else." Something inside her shifted, uneasy, unfamiliar, almost tender. She didn't answer. She simply nodded and resumed. By the time they finished, the room felt warmer, though neither had moved closer physically. The closeness existed in something else. An unspoken trust. A recognition she hadn't invited yet couldn't ignore. He gathered his notebook, offering her a quiet smile. "You're ready," he said. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that her competence wasn't shadowed by time, that she still had the right to be seen, valued, and admired. But a deeper fear lingered beneath all of it. The fear of exposure, not just on stage, but in the fragile places of her heart she had long hidden. As he walked toward the door, she watched him, trying to steady the breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. She wasn't ready for what his presence awakened. But the truth was no longer polite enough to be ignored. The auditorium filled slowly, a wave of bodies moving toward rows of cushioned seats under dimmed lights. The stage glowed with a soft amber hue, highlighting the podium where countless speakers had stood before, their voices rising and dissolving into this vast, echoing room. She stood backstage, adjusting the sleeve of her blazer with practiced precision, forcing her hands to remain steady. The rehearsal had gone well enough, but the tension beneath her ribs throbbed quietly, a stubborn reminder of how much she feared being scrutinized, especially here, especially today. Through the slit between the curtains, she could see him. He was speaking with a colleague near the front row, calm and composed, his gestures subtle, his expression thoughtful. He wasn't performing confidence the way so many people in the room did. He simply inhabited it. She envied that ease, even as she resented the way her gaze sought him out involuntarily. She pulled herself back, inhaling deeply, anchoring her thoughts. The program began with introductions and brief acknowledgments. Applause rose and faded like tides washing the edges of a shore. When it was his turn to speak, he climbed the steps with a measured stride. She watched from the side of the stage, trying to remain detached, reminding herself that this was just another presentation. Professional, predictable, controlled. He greeted the audience with his usual calm tone, the microphone carrying his voice through the room in a warm, steady rhythm. He spoke clearly, outlining the project's progress and explaining the methodology with the precision she had always admired. He didn't rush, didn't stumble. Every sentence flowed like a quiet river turning corners effortlessly. She relaxed slightly, confident he would follow the script they had finalized together. He always respected structure, but halfway through his speech, something shifted. He paused for a fraction of a second, not long enough for the audience to notice, but long enough for her to sense it. His eyes drifted from the slides, moving slowly across the room until they settled on her silhouette at the edge of the curtain. The contact was brief, almost accidental, yet something inside her tightened, an instinctive recognition of a moment about to step outside its boundaries. He continued speaking, but not from the script. "I want to acknowledge something," he said, his voice still measured but carrying a different tenor now. Softer, more deliberate. "This project has demanded long hours, difficult decisions, and constant adaptation. And I wouldn't be here, none of us would, without someone whose guidance shaped every stage of this work." Her stomach dropped. He wasn't supposed to say this. Not like this. Not in front of an entire auditorium. He took another breath, steady and sincere. "Her experience has carried this project. Her discipline set our foundation, and her strength, quiet, constant, often unnoticed, has been the anchor for all of us." The room went silent, a hush spreading like frost across glass. He didn't name her, but he didn't need to. Every pair of eyes began searching the audience for the woman he was describing. She felt dozens of invisible fingers point toward her, rippling through the rows like a rumor blooming into certainty. He didn't look away. "She taught me more than the data shows," he continued softly. "More than the slides explain." His gaze held hers, unguarded. "She showed me what integrity looks like in practice." Her heartbeat pounded so loudly she felt it in her throat. She had never been described like this, not publicly, not personally, not with such disarming sincerity. Admiration from colleagues usually came wrapped in formality or diluted praise. But this felt raw, honest, exposing. He closed his statement gracefully, returning to the technical points as though nothing extraordinary had happened. But the atmosphere had changed. People shifted in their seats. A few exchanged glances. Others leaned forward, curious. The air pulsed with speculation, with the silent question hanging above their heads. Who was he talking about? She fought the urge to flee backstage, to escape the spotlight that had suddenly turned in her direction. Her pulse raced, her palms damp despite the cool air of the auditorium. She stepped back from the curtain, needing distance, needing air. As he finished the presentation, applause erupted, sharp and enthusiastic. He accepted it with modesty, but she could feel the lingering weight in the room. Conversations buzzed softly as he descended the steps, walking off stage with the same calm expression he had worn at the start. But she knew. He knew. And now, everyone else would know, or at least suspect enough to invent their own stories. She slipped deeper into the backstage corridor as he approached, avoiding the possibility of crossing his path. She heard his footsteps growing closer before turning toward the crowd outside. He didn't call her name. He didn't seek her out. But that made it worse. It meant he knew exactly what he had done and understood that the consequences would begin long before either of them spoke privately. She leaned against the cool wall, breathing in the faint smell of dust and electrical cables. Her mind spun. His words had been beautiful, too brave, too revealing. They stirred a tenderness she had spent months trying to ignore, but they also ignited terror. He had exposed something she wasn't ready to face. Not in public. Not before she understood what it meant. Not before she even admitted it to herself. The applause from the auditorium still echoed faintly as she stepped into the hallway, but the sound felt distant, muted by the roaring tension inside her chest. People were already spilling out of the double doors, filling the corridor with a blend of voices, perfume, and hurried footsteps. She walked quickly, keeping her head down, hoping to disappear into the flow of bodies before anyone recognized her. But the whispers reached her before the faces did. "Did you hear what he said?" He wasn't talking about the data. Who could he have meant? It sounded personal, didn't it? She felt the words like gusts of cold wind slipping under her clothes. She didn't stop, didn't slow, but the pressure of the murmurs pressed against her back with every step. Her lungs tightened, her breath shortening as she maneuvered between small clusters of colleagues. A pair of women near the coffee table glanced at her just long enough to make her skin prickle. Their whispers quieted as she passed, the kind of silence that wasn't silence at all, but an unfinished sentence waiting for her to be out of earshot. She kept walking. Her heels clicked sharply on the polished floor, each step louder than it should have been. She could feel eyes lifting toward her, some curious, some speculative, some judging. She wasn't arrogant enough to believe the entire event revolved around her, but she wasn't naive either. She had lived long enough in professional environments to know that admiration for older women often came laced with suspicion, assumptions, or worse, ridicule. She reached for her phone in her bag, not because she needed it, but because holding something made her feel anchored. Notifications blinked across the screen, missed calls, messages, meeting reminders, but she ignored them. All she wanted was an exit. Down the corridor, she saw him leaving the stage area, greeting a few people, smiling politely, answering questions. He didn't look in her direction, but she sensed his awareness like a pulse shared across distance. She turned away immediately, slipping behind a group heading toward the elevators. Someone called her name, but she pretended not to hear. She reached the elevator bank just as one of the doors opened. A handful of people stepped inside, and she followed quickly, grateful for the temporary shelter of the small metal box. The doors closed with a soft thud. For a moment, silence returned. A brief, suspended relief. But then two people behind her resumed their conversation in low voices, unaware she was listening. "You don't think he meant her, do you?" "Well, she's definitely the most experienced on the team." "Please, that wasn't about experience. Do you think they—" "I'm just saying. It sounded intimate." The elevator hummed downward, every floor feeling like it took years to reach. She stared at the reflective metal of the doors, avoiding eye contact with the distorted versions of herself staring back. Her cheeks felt warm, her throat tight, her heart beating unfairly fast. When the doors opened, she stepped out quickly, ignoring the polite "after you" from someone beside her. She moved through the lobby with long, determined strides. The building's glass facade revealed the outside world. Cars passing, people crossing the street, the sky beginning to dim into early evening. She pushed through the revolving door, the cool air hitting her face like a wake-up call. She inhaled sharply, filling her lungs to their limit as if trying to purge the tightness inside her. She continued walking toward the side street, away from the main entrance, away from the conversations that were no doubt multiplying behind her. The sound of traffic grounded her, the familiar chaos of the city offering refuge from the curated structure of the event. But even as she walked, the humiliation pulsed through her. It wasn't because of what he said. His words had been sincere, beautiful even. The pain came from how exposed she felt, how vulnerable he had made her without warning, how quickly admiration could twist into gossip. She reached a quieter corner and stopped, bracing one hand against the wall as she breathed deeply. She needed to think, but every thought tangled with emotion. His voice replayed in her memory, the warmth, the certainty, the undeniable respect. She closed her eyes for a moment, allowing the honesty of it to touch her, even as the fear lingered like a shadow. She wasn't angry at him. Not exactly. She was overwhelmed, unprepared, terrified of what people might say, but even more terrified of what she herself might want. A car drove by, splashing through a shallow puddle. A group of teenagers laughed as they passed. Life continued as if nothing seismic had happened inside her that afternoon. She straightened her posture, pulling her coat tighter around her shoulders. She needed distance, from the event, from the whispers, from him, at least for now. Because if she didn't step away, she feared she wouldn't be able to hide what had already begun to unravel inside her. The hotel corridor felt unnaturally long, lined with identical doors and muted carpet that softened every footstep. She walked quickly, head lowered, hoping the distance between the lobby and her room would help settle the chaos still swirling inside her. But each step only amplified the unease. Every echo of her heels felt like a reminder of the moment she wished she could erase, or at least understand. She reached the elevator bank, pressed the button, and wrapped her arms around herself while waiting. The lobby behind her buzzed with conversations from other guests and attendees, but she didn't turn back. She could still feel the weight of the auditorium's whispers lingering on her skin like a residue she couldn't wash off. The cold air from the corridor vent brushed her neck, and she shivered, though not from temperature. The elevator dinged, and the doors slid open. She stepped inside and exhaled in relief. Finally, a moment alone. The doors began to close, but just before they met, a hand slipped between them, triggering the sensors. The panels recoiled smoothly. He stepped inside. Her breath caught almost painfully at the sight of him, but she didn't flinch. She simply shifted slightly, leaving space between them, though the smallness of the elevator made distance feel more symbolic than real. He pressed his floor number, then stood still, hands relaxed at his sides, posture steady. The doors slid shut with a soft thud. Silence wrapped around them, thick and unavoidable. She kept her gaze fixed on the ascending numbers above the door as the elevator began to move. Her pulse quickened. She didn't trust herself to speak. She didn't trust what might spill out if she tried. The air felt tight, charged with everything they hadn't said. He stayed quiet too, but not distantly. His presence was careful, intentional, like he understood she needed space, but also knew that space alone couldn't shield her from the truth lingering between them. When the elevator passed the first floor, he finally spoke. "I didn't mean to put you in a difficult position." His voice was low, steady, almost hesitant. She closed her eyes briefly as the words settled over her. Apologies from him always carried sincerity, never the hollow politeness she often heard from others. And yet, the sincerity only made it harder to breathe. She opened her eyes, staring straight ahead. "That wasn't something you should have said in public." A soft exhale left him, as if he had expected her reaction but still felt the impact of hearing it aloud. "I know," he replied, but it was the truth. The elevator hummed as it climbed. Her grip tightened on the strap of her bag. Truth. He said it so simply, as though truth had no consequences, as though truth didn't reshape the way people looked at her, judge her, whisper behind her back. "You should have followed the script," she said quietly. He didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. He simply let the silence stretch again, heavy and fragile. When the elevator passed the third floor, he spoke once more, his voice softer than before. "I didn't say anything inappropriate." She knew he was right. His words had been respectful, admiring even, but admiration when spoken in public could feel like exposure. And exposure, for someone like her, was another form of risk. She wasn't afraid of her feelings. She was afraid of what people would do with them. "That doesn't matter," she whispered. "People will twist things. They already are." He turned slightly, just enough that she could sense his gaze without meeting it. "And what do you think they'll say?" The question pierced something inside her. She swallowed hard. "You know exactly what they'll say." The age difference hovered between them. Undeniable, unspoken, sharp. He didn't push. He didn't step closer. He simply asked, "Does it bother you because they're talking, or because I meant every word?" Her breath hitched. The elevator kept rising, its mechanical monotony mocking the storm inside her. She didn't answer. The doors opened on her floor with a soft chime. She stepped out quickly, desperate for escape, for solitude, for anything that helped her regain control of the emotions he stirred so effortlessly. But before the doors closed, he spoke one last time. "I didn't expose you. I honored you." The panels slid shut. She stood frozen in the hallway, heart pounding, his final sentence echoing in her chest with unsettling clarity. She didn't move until the elevator's hum disappeared completely. Only then did she realize the truth she feared most wasn't the whispers of others. It was the possibility that his words had touched a part of her she could no longer deny. The days that followed unfolded with a quiet tension she could feel in every corner of her life. She returned to the office with the precision of someone rebuilding a wall, brick by brick. Her emails were brief, her tone impeccably formal, her boundaries unmistakable. Nothing in her gestures revealed the turmoil underneath. She became the version of herself she trusted most, the distant, measured professional who never let emotion dictate a single step. She told herself it was necessary. She told herself it was the only way to regain control. She kept her door closed more often than usual, filling her schedule with meetings that didn't require his presence. When team discussions were unavoidable, she sat at the far end of the table, her eyes fixed on documents or screens, never drifting toward him even when she felt his gaze brushing against her like a question left unanswered. He respected her distance. Too much, perhaps. He didn't seek her out. He didn't corner her in hallways or ask to speak privately. He simply adjusted his presence to match the space she created, staying near enough to fulfill his responsibilities, but far enough not to intrude. And somehow, that hurt more. Her phone became a battlefield. Every morning she typed messages she never sent, long ones explaining her fear, short ones pretending indifference, and some that were little more than confessions she deleted as soon as she read them back. Her drafts folder was a graveyard of words she couldn't risk turning into actions. "Thank you for what you said. You shouldn't have said it. It meant more than you know. It frightened me. I don't know what to do with any of this." She deleted them all. In the evenings, she replayed the auditorium moment until the memory blurred at the edges. But his voice never did. The gentleness, the certainty, the unexpected vulnerability of his praise repeated like a melody she couldn't mute. She hated how deeply it reached her. She hated how much she wanted to hear it again. Not publicly, but in the safety of a quieter space. Meanwhile, the office carried its own undercurrent of speculation. She felt it in sidelong glances, in pauses during conversations, in the subtle tightening of expressions when she entered a room. No one said anything directly. People rarely showed their cruelty openly, but the softness in their tones when they spoke to her felt patronizing, as though they were humoring a story they believed they had figured out. She caught two people whispering near the break room. Their voices dropped when she approached. She didn't confront them. She simply walked away, spine straight, face unreadable. She'd learned long ago that dignity was her sharpest weapon, even when it cost her more than she wanted to admit. He, on the other hand, moved through the office with his usual calm. If the rumors reached him, he didn't show it. He kept his expression even, his interactions professional, his presence steady but subdued. The steadiness both comforted and frustrated her. She wanted him to defend her. She wanted him to forget her. She wanted him to say something. She wanted him to say nothing. Her contradictions exhausted her. One afternoon, she saw him standing alone by the window near the conference rooms, sunlight outlining his profile. He was holding a folder, reading through its pages. Unaware she had paused halfway down the hall. She watched him for a few seconds, longer than she should have. She noticed the quiet thoughtfulness in his expression, the way he absorbed information with sincerity rather than ambition. She wondered what it would feel like to step toward him instead of away. But then a group of employees turned the corner, and she forced herself to keep walking. That evening, she sat in her car in the parking lot long after the engine turned off. The sky had begun to darken, streaked with fading colors. She rested her forehead against the steering wheel, letting the silence envelop her. She didn't cry. She didn't know how to cry over something that wasn't loss, wasn't love, wasn't anything defined. It was tension, hope, fear, longing, all woven into a knot she couldn't unravel. When she finally lifted her head, her phone buzzed. For a split second, her heart leapt, irrationally hoping it was him. It wasn't. Just another reminder. Another deadline. She put the phone aside and stared at the empty screen, wondering how a man she hadn't touched, hadn't kissed, hadn't even allowed close, could still feel so dangerously near. At home, she brewed tea she didn't drink, opened a book she didn't read, and sat in the soft glow of her living room lamp, surrounded by a quiet that once felt safe, but now felt hollow. She thought of him, of the sincerity in his voice, of the steadiness in his eyes, of the way he seemed to understand her without requiring pieces of her she wasn't ready to give. She whispered into the empty room, as though to convince herself, this isn't anything. But the silence answered honestly. It already was. The conference room was quiet when she arrived. Too quiet for a space usually buzzing with overlapping voices and hurried footsteps. The long table stretched toward the windows, where afternoon light filtered through half-closed blinds, casting soft stripes across the polished wood. She hesitated in the doorway, holding a folder she didn't need, pretending it offered purpose rather than protection. The meeting had been scheduled last minute, a necessary review of pending tasks, nothing more. At least that was what she tried to believe. But when he walked in moments later, closing the door behind him, the silence shifted. It thickened, charged with everything they had avoided for days. He carried no equipment, no stack of papers, only himself, steady and unguarded. His eyes met hers briefly, not demanding, not hesitant, simply present. She looked away first. He took a seat across from her, leaving the length of the table between them, though the air felt narrow, compressed. She kept her gaze on the documents in front of her, flipping through pages she'd already memorized. His voice broke the silence gently. "We need to talk about what happened." Her pulse quickened. She placed the documents down slowly, aligning their edges with precise care. "We're here to finalize the project updates," she replied, keeping her tone controlled. "There's nothing else to discuss." He didn't argue. Instead, he watched her with quiet patience, the kind that dissolved defenses without a single forceful gesture. "You've barely looked at me in days," he said, not accusing, simply acknowledging reality. "And I know it's because of what I said." She felt heat rise in her chest, not anger, fear, the raw kind. "You stepped out of line," she said. "You exposed something that didn't belong on a stage." He leaned back slightly, absorbing her words with thoughtful stillness. "I spoke the truth," he answered, "and I didn't expose anything. I acknowledged you." Her breathing tightened. A part of her wanted to dismiss his sincerity as naivety, but she knew better. He wasn't reckless. He wasn't impulsive. Everything he did came from genuine conviction, and that made it harder to distance herself. "People are talking," she whispered. "They're making assumptions. They're twisting things." "I know," he said softly, "but that isn't why you're upset." His certainty unsettled her. She stood abruptly, moving toward the windows as though the filtered light could shield her from his gaze. She crossed her arms, staring at the faint reflection of her own silhouette, faint lines on her face, tension etched into her posture, age written in ways she had learned both to accept and to fear. "You don't understand what it's like," she said, her voice low. "You walk into a room and people assume potential. I walk in and they assume expiration. Every compliment becomes condescension. Every mistake becomes proof. And when you stood there and said those things, beautiful things, you turned me into a spectacle." He rose slowly, but didn't move closer. His reflection appeared beside hers in the glass, taller, younger, steady in a way that made her chest ache. "I didn't speak to embarrass you," he said. "I spoke because you deserved to be recognized, and because I meant every word." She squeezed her eyes shut, wishing she could silence the part of her that reacted so deeply to his honesty. "That's the problem," she whispered. "You meant it." The room held its breath. He approached a few steps, stopping far enough to respect the fragile boundary she maintained. "You think this is about age," he said, "but it isn't. Not for me." She opened her eyes slowly, meeting his reflection instead of his direct gaze. "It matters," she insisted. "Maybe not for you, but for everyone watching, for everything I've built. I can't afford to be someone's rumor." He nodded, absorbing her fear without dismissing it. "I know the cost is higher for you," he said. "I know you've had to fight to be taken seriously at every stage of your career. I see that. I respect that. But I need you to know something." Her heart braced itself. He exhaled softly. "I didn't say those words because I'm young, or because I don't understand consequences. I said them because you changed me, because working with you has been the most meaningful experience I've had here, because you carry strength in ways people overlook, and I refuse to be one of the people who pretend not to see it." His voice softened further. "And I'm not asking for anything. Not a label, not a response, not even a chance. I just needed you to know that what I feel isn't a rumor. It isn't a misunderstanding. It's mine, and I'm responsible for it, not you." Her breath trembled. No one had ever given her permission not to answer, not to protect, not to perform. She turned toward him slowly, meeting his eyes directly for the first time in days. They held no expectation, only quiet conviction. A warmth rose in her chest, unexpected, uninvited, but undeniably real. In that moment, something inside her cracked. Not in pain, but in recognition. He wasn't trying to claim her. He was trying to free her from the weight of being claimed by others. She didn't step closer. She didn't confess anything. She simply let herself breathe in a room where the truth had finally been spoken, without fear. For now, that was enough. The night stretched long and unyielding, as though time itself refused to move until she confronted the thoughts she had avoided for years. She sat on the edge of her bed, still dressed in the clothes she had worn to the office, her jacket draped across a chair, her shoes left near the door. The room was dim, lit only by the lamp on her nightstand, casting soft shadows that made everything appear slightly blurred. It was a fitting reflection of her own mind, uncertain, scattered, suspended between fear and truth. She removed her earrings slowly, placing them in the small dish she kept beside the lamp. The simple act felt heavier than it should have. Every movement that night carried weight, as if she were peeling off layers she had worn for decades. She walked to the mirror above her dresser and studied her reflection. The woman staring back at her looked tired, not physically, but emotionally. Her eyes held the remnants of the confrontation from earlier, mixed with memories she had tried to bury beneath achievement and discipline. She traced the edge of her jaw with her fingertips, noticing the softness age had brought. The lines around her eyes were deeper now, etched by years of laughter, grief, and resilience. She didn't resent them, but she feared how others interpreted them. For most of her life, she had been told, directly or indirectly, that women had an invisible timeline. Youth was currency. Beauty was armor. Age was a quiet erasure. She had resisted erasure with every breath, building a life defined by precision, dignity, and unshakable competence. But competence didn't erase loneliness, and dignity didn't silence longing. She sat on the edge of the bed again and let her shoulders fall, releasing a breath she had been holding for days. His words replayed in her mind, not the public ones, but the ones from the closed room. "I'm not asking for anything. I'm responsible for my feelings, not you." That sentence lingered with surprising tenderness. It didn't pressure her. It didn't demand reciprocation. It simply existed as an offering of truth without expectation. She had spent years surrounded by people who took from her time, her patience, her energy, but he offered something unfamiliar: accountability, respect, a space where she wasn't required to earn worthiness. Still, fear persisted. She walked to the window and looked at the city lights flickering across the skyline. Cars moved like small veins of light, weaving through darkened streets. Somewhere among those moving pieces of the world were people who would judge her without hesitation if they ever knew the truth of what stirred between her and him. She imagined the comments, the raised eyebrows, the patronizing tones dressed as concern. She imagined whispers about her age, her choices, her dignity. Age gap relationships were tolerated when the man was older, revered even. But when the woman carried the years, the judgment sharpened. Society had never learned to see older women as worthy of admiration, affection, or possibility. She pressed her forehead against the cool glass. Fear wrapped itself around her ribs like a cage, but another thought rose quietly beneath it. What if she was tired of being ruled by fear? What if age wasn't a warning sign but a chapter marker? What if his admiration wasn't a mistake, but a mirror reflecting something she had forgotten? The part of her that still deserved tenderness? She stepped back from the window and sat at her desk. Her phone rested beside her laptop, silent and waiting. She opened a blank message to him. Words appeared slowly, hesitantly. "I heard you today, and I don't know what to do with any of it." She stared at the message until her eyes blurred. It was too raw, too vulnerable. She deleted it. She tried again. "We need to keep things professional." Delete. "Thank you for being honest." Delete. Everything she typed felt wrong. Too cold, too honest, too afraid, too open. She dropped the phone on the desk, pressing her palms over her face. A long moment passed. When she finally lowered her hands, she noticed something shifting inside her. Not clarity, not courage, but a small crack in the wall she had built. She wasn't ready to step through it. but she could finally see the other side. She returned to the bed, pulling the blanket over her legs. The room felt slightly warmer now. She lay back, staring at the ceiling, letting her thoughts settle like dust in sunlight. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to imagine the possibility of choosing something not because it was safe, but because it was true. Not because it was expected, but because it made her feel alive again. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring. She didn't know what she would say to him. But she knew one undeniable thing. Fear had been her compass for too long. Maybe it was time to choose a different direction. The shoreline stretched before her in muted tones of blue and gray, the late afternoon light softening the edges of everything it touched. Waves rose and folded into themselves with rhythmic patience, brushing against the rocks before retreating in quiet surrender. She stood at the railing overlooking the ocean, the wind tugging gently at her hair, carrying with it the faint scent of salt and distant rain. She hadn't chosen this place randomly. The ocean had always offered her a strange comfort, a reminder that some forces in life moved beyond judgment, beyond expectation, beyond the gaze of others. She wrapped her coat tighter around her body, not because of the cold, but because the moment felt fragile. She had sent him a brief message earlier, a simple request to meet by the shore. No explanations, no context. Part of her worried he might misunderstand. Another part worried he might decline. Yet the deeper truth was that she needed this conversation in a place untouched by their colleagues, by whispers, by assumptions. The sound of approaching footsteps reached her before she saw him. She turned slowly. He walked toward her with the same calm steadiness he carried into every space, but there was a softness in his expression now, a quiet awareness that the moment was delicate, that she was delicate, no matter how strongly she stood. He stopped beside her, leaving a respectful distance. "Thank you for coming," she said, her voice gentler than she intended. "I would have come anywhere you asked," he replied, though without theatrics, without intensity, just truth spoken plainly. They faced the ocean together, neither speaking for a while. The silence wasn't heavy this time. It wasn't tense. It was a pause shared between two people who finally stood without pretense, waiting for words that mattered. She breathed slowly, letting the air steady her. "What you said that day, it caught me off guard. I know. It changed how people look at me. I know that too." She exhaled, watching the waves roll in. "And it changed how I look at myself." He turned slightly, not enough to intrude, but enough to listen with his full attention. She felt the warmth of his presence beside her, quiet, constant, like a tide that refused to retreat. "I've spent years," she continued, "protecting myself from being reduced to something fragile or foolish. I've built a life around control, predictability, boundaries." She paused, steadying her breath. "And then you come along. And one moment, one sentence, breaks more of my defenses than I ever expected." He didn't apologize. She didn't want him to. Instead, he waited, the patience in his silence giving her room to continue. "I needed time," she said. "Not because I doubted your sincerity, but because I doubted my ability to navigate what came after. I don't know how to deal with being admired by someone younger, someone who sees me in ways I stopped seeing myself." His voice was quiet but unwavering. "I didn't admire you because I'm young. I admire you because you're extraordinary." The words settled into her like a slow-burning warmth. She didn't look at him immediately. Instead, she stared at the sea, letting the moment anchor itself gently. "You've complicated my life," she said, with a faint, almost reluctant smile. "And I don't say that lightly." He returned the smile, though his remained subtle. "You've complicated mine too, but I don't regret it." She closed her eyes briefly, letting the wind move across her face. "I'm afraid," she confessed. "Afraid of judgment. Afraid of ruining what I've built. Afraid of wanting something I'm not sure I'm allowed to want." He stepped closer. Not enough to break the boundary she still needed, but close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. "You don't owe me an answer," he said. "Not today. Not ever. I'm not here to rush you into anything. I'm here because I care about you, and I want you to feel safe, no matter what you choose." His restraint, his maturity, His refusal to claim her. Those were the things that undid her more than any declaration could have. She finally turned toward him, her gaze steady, vulnerable in a way she had not allowed herself to be in years. "I don't know what this is," she said. "I don't know what it could be. But I do know I don't want to keep running from reality." He nodded slowly, understanding the weight of her words. "Then we start with something simple," he said. "No labels. No assumptions. No need to prove anything to anyone. Just honesty, respect, and whatever pace feels right for you." She felt something inside her loosen, a knot that had held tight for too long. For once, the lack of certainty didn't frighten her. It softened her, freed her. She stepped a little closer, not touching him, but standing beside him in a way that acknowledged something new, something real. The ocean stretched ahead, endless and unbothered by human fears. "Then let's agree on one thing," she said. "Whatever this becomes, it won't be defined by whispers or judgment or fear. It will be defined here." She touched her hand to her chest gently. "By what feels true." His eyes warmed, the softest shift in expression revealing how deeply her words reached him. "I agree," he answered. They stood in silence again, watching the sun sink toward the horizon, painting the water in shades of copper and soft gold. The moment didn't demand promises or declarations. It simply allowed them to exist side by side, seen for who they were, not for what others expected them to be. It wasn't a beginning marked by fireworks or dramatic confessions. It was quieter, stronger, a choice made in stillness, a silent agreement to walk forward with honesty, courage, and the steady understanding that whatever grew between them would be theirs alone, untouched by anyone else's story.